welcome back. This is lesson 5-6 on life during the Great Depression. We're going to see just how really miserable it was during the Great Depression. It was depressing. The Dust Bowl was just a situation that just, kicking America while we were down. In the 1930s, the American Southwest was hit by a severe drought, no rain at all. And to compile our problem there, we'd had some really bad farming techniques. Now, the farmers of the time, they really did know better. They knew they shouldn't be working the land and the soil the way that they were. But the drive for profits and to get some food out of the land was so high that they were doing these farming techniques that were just, they were going to kill the land. And indeed it did. And it created something called the Dust Bowl, where winds would sweep up and the loose soil, the loose dried up, no good soil right up at the top of the land would just get blown away in these big, huge clouds. And you can see the cloud right here. I mean, clouds of dust would just blanket communities. And worse than that for the farmers, it would also blow across the land and would layer on top of the crops. And the crops with all this dust and dirt on top of them couldn't grow. And so the food would just die right there in the fields. It was really a mess. And it created a situation where farmers could not survive on the land in the American Southwest. And this triggered a massive migration, farmers leaving that area to try to go someplace else to eke out a living. And for most of them, this destination wound up being California. California was overwhelmed with 2.5 million people. 2.5 million people were fleeing Oklahoma, Kansas, and a few other hard-hit areas, heading out to California to try to make a living out there. Migration routes largely to Southern California, but also going out to Colorado and Washington from this Dust Bowl area. This is where it really gets bad. And it created a problem, not just for that region, but also for those in California who now had all these unemployed people in their streets. All across the country, people were having a hard time. People had lost their homes. They lived in Hoovervilles. Remember those scraps of wood thrown together to make things that resembled a house, just thrown together in communities? They lived under bridges, or they just lived out in the open, lived in a tent in the middle of the field. Wherever they could bunk down, people were bunking down. And to get food, government handouts. One of those FDR New Deal programs to get food to the poor was the best that people could hope for. And people would stand in line for hours to get a half a loaf of bread and a bowl of soup from the government as their only source of food during these hard times. And of course, things were always hardest for children. Many children during this time felt the real need to help their family and to provide for their family. So children dropped out of school at record numbers to try to find some sort of a job to help support their family. And those who couldn't find a job, teenagers in particular, frequently felt like they didn't want to be a burden to their parents. They didn't want their parents to feel like they had to feed their teenage child and therefore go hungry themselves. Or worse, a younger sibling, a 5-6-year-old, wouldn't get as much food because the parents had to feed the teenager as well. So teenagers were running away from home at record numbers, simply because they realized that at home, they were more of a burden than a help. And by 1932, 3 years into the Great Depression, 250,000 teenagers had run away from home for this region. So life during the Great Depression was incredibly hard. And one thing that came out that lasts from this is the work of artists at that time. Artists were trying to capture this feeling in America so that we could remember what it was like and look back on it today. Most famous to do this were John Steinbeck, wrote a series of books, The Grapes of Wrath being one, Of Mice and Men. They all take place during this Great Depression and look at the average American person and how they're dealing with these problems. Photographer Dorothea Lange took this and many other iconic photos of the time just to show how personal this experience, this Great Depression was. It's not just economics, it's not just numbers, it's a mother not being able to feed her kids and sitting homeless on a street. And their work is really a reminder of the hard lessons of the Great Depression. Now, during this Great Depression, women see an increased role in government. And this was largely an effort because of the efforts of Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt was the wife of Theodore Roosevelt and was a tenacious politician herself and a real advocate for women's rights and workers' rights. She was going out there to change the world. She wasn't just, the wife of the president. She was going to use this position to make the world a better place. And she traveled throughout the nation. She witnessed the problems of our society firsthand, and she sat in these meetings and she directed government leaders on how we can fix them. And most famous of her partners was probably the Labor Secretary, Frances Perkins, who also happened to be the first female cabinet member. And they worked together to establish things like minimum wage laws. So you could not pay a worker less than a certain amount. And it was supposed to be a livable wage. And we also had a limit to child labor. Okay, children should be going to school. Save those jobs for adults. We also want to look at what's going on with civil rights African Americans during the Great Depression. Now, Roosevelt wants to be a model for how we live in a society with better civil rights. And to do this, he brings many African Americans into government. And he's quoted publicly as saying things such as, "We must scrupulously guard the civil rights and civil liberties of all of our citizens, whatever their background. We must remember that any oppression, any injustice, any hatred is a wedge designed to attack our civilization." This is a message clearly stating that we must make sure that we treat each other well. But in terms of policy, he did not pursue civil rights. And he didn't do this for the same reason that the progressive presidents didn't as well. He feared losing the support of Southerners for other things that he was trying to do. In this case, New Deal programs. So without the support of Southern Democrats, he did not think he could pass the New Deal programs. He prioritized the economy over civil rights. And so in terms of policy, never took a stance on civil rights issues. We also want to touch base on Mexican Americans and see what's happening here during the Great Depression. See, as unemployment is increasing, so does racism against Mexican Americans. We see this in America all the time. It's one of those cycles. It's one of those reasons why it's good to know history, because you know these things are going to happen. When the economy gets bad, we Americans become more and more racist against Hispanics, Mexicans in particular. During the 1920s, we didn't care. In the 1920s, illegal immigration was helpful. The more illegal immigrants came to the United States, the more cheap farm labor we had. And it helped the economy be so successful. Illegal immigration was a tremendous benefit to our country because the economy was good. And then when unemployment increased and people didn't have jobs, all of a sudden there's this big pressure and this hatred. It's like, oh, these Mexicans are taking our jobs. These are jobs Americans didn't want, but these darn Mexicans coming in and taking jobs from Americans. We see this in society today. During the Great Recession, over the last 10 years, racism against Mexican Americans increased. And you really saw this during the 2016 presidential election and the campaign of Donald Trump. Build a wall, build a wall. It's all hatred of Mexicans, but it's really rooted in economic problems. Now, as a student of history, you will know that as the economy gets better over the next 2-3 years, and it will get better over the next 2-3 years, you're going to see less and less talk about how the Mexicans are a problem. Watch it. It's a cycle. It happens every time. All right. How about unions? The Wagner Act was a part of the Second New Deal. It was part of trying to help labor get better rights so that the American worker had better pay. And as a part of this act, a commission was set up within the government to hear union and business disputes. Whenever a union and a business had a problem, the government now has the authority to step in and solve that problem and to somewhat dictate the solution to it. And the government does do this sometimes. Not often, but they do this. And partly as a result of this, union membership will increase. The government exists to protect the people. The government is now going to step in and mediate union and business disputes. Therefore, unions will increase in power, and they increase particularly in membership. From 1933 to 1937, Americans wanted to be part of a union. All right, so this was a look at America during the Great Depression. We saw that Dust Bowl and westward migration. We see homelessness, runaways. We see artists, which is a positive. We see women getting more involved in government. The continued issue of civil rights versus political priorities. Racism and its cycles, and we're in another one now. And of course, the rise of union membership. I hope that you learned something today, or that you at least enjoyed this lesson, and I will see you next time. Farewell.